When a quiet child in a courtroom reveals a cryptic note, the words on that small scrap of paper send chills through everyone present. What first appears to be a routine custody hearing soon unravels into something far darker, a tale of hidden cruelty and silent courage that threatens to destroy lives. If you believe the truth should always come to light, let us know where you're watching from and be sure to like and subscribe for more. The air in the crowded courtroom felt heavy, as though something was brewing just under the surface. People rarely paid attention to standard custody hearings, but on this particular day, an unspoken tension thickened the atmosphere. Judge Simon Miller, a man in his late 50s with weary lines beneath his eyes, sat at the bench, shuffling through paperwork and trying to maintain the usual briskness of legal proceedings. He was used to routine. He was used to the monotony of the foster system churn, a parade of social workers, children needing permanency, couples eager to adopt. Yet there was an undercurrent in the air that made him straighten his back. A small boy, no more than 12, was seated quietly beside his caseworker. He was called Brandon, a typical name, one that Judge Miller had seen on dozens of files over the years. The boy's hair was carefully combed, and he wore a sweater vest that seemed almost too neat, like someone else had picked it out for him. Brandon's expression was carefully controlled. His posture seemed disciplined, as if he had worked very hard at presenting himself as docile and well-behaved. To his left sat Michael and Dana Weller, a polished couple who exuded confidence. Their attorney hovered behind them. Judge Miller had started with basic questions, the ones he asked at every adoption hearing. Brandon had responded by nodding or shaking his head. Even as the judge's gentle voice prodded him, Brandon didn't speak. His silence registered as polite compliance at first. Yet the deeper Judge Miller looked into the boy's eyes, the more he suspected that behind that quiet exterior, Brandon might be screaming for help. When the judge put the final question to him, "Do you want to say anything before I finish the paperwork?" Something in Brandon's composure cracked. The boy's lips parted, but no words came. Instead, he reached into his pocket and retrieved a small, folded scrap of paper. Hesitating only a second, he offered it up like a confession. When Judge Miller carefully unfolded it, 3 words stared back at him in frantic, uneven handwriting. "Look behind garage." A crudely drawn map accompanied the words, depicting a house, a garage, and a single red X. A cold sensation slid down Judge Miller's spine. The boy's eyes were wide, pleading. The judge had been on the bench for decades. He had developed a sixth sense for trouble. At that moment, he knew something was very wrong. He cleared his throat, closed the note, and simply said, "I'm calling a short recess." What followed next felt like a speeding train, unstoppable and dangerous, gathering momentum. Within the hour, officers were dispatched to the Wellers' immaculate suburban home. Michael and Dana answered the door, beaming their usual polite smiles. They offered coffee, guided the officers through the foyer, the living room, the pristinely kept kitchen. Everything about the place looked like a showroom, neat, tidy, with not a speck of dust in sight. But when asked to see the garage, Michael stiffened. He tried to dismiss it as a renovation zone. The officers persisted. Michael handed over the keys with marked reluctance. Inside the garage, they discovered a suspicious patch of wooden paneling that didn't match the rest. A few taps from an officer's knuckles produced a hollow echo. The officers pried it open to reveal a claustrophobic stairwell leading down into darkness. At the bottom, flashlights uncovered a concrete cell. No windows. A single mattress. A mounted camera. Tally marks etched into the walls. At least 3 names had been scrawled in a corner. Brandon's name was not there. The fallout was immediate. The hidden space was declared a crime scene. Michael and Dana's pristine smiles evaporated as police pressed forward with more questions. Back at the courthouse, Brandon's trembling shoulders eased slightly when Judge Miller returned and thanked him, his voice thick with subdued anger. As the next days and weeks unfolded, investigators discovered evidence of an elaborate scheme. Children were being placed with the Wellers and disappearing from the official records soon after. Yet that discovery was only the tip of the iceberg. Not many people knew much about Brandon's life before that courtroom moment. He was something of a drifter in the system, having shuffled between foster families since he was 6. A shy boy by nature, he had learned to keep to himself. He had spent the last 8 weeks with the Wellers, and nobody had suspected anything amiss. They had a sterling reputation. On the surface, they appeared philanthropic, devoted to helping children, always well-spoken at gatherings. But behind that cultivated veneer, a quiet horror lurked. Michael Weller was an expert at faking documents, forging signatures, and making sure that every child's exit from his home appeared legitimate. Some children allegedly reunited with distant relatives, while others were supposedly transferred to group homes. None of that was true. Dana Weller was the one who ran the actual program behind closed doors. Her notebooks detailing psychological conditioning, isolation periods, compliance techniques, and every other twisted method of controlling children. She had once held a behavioral therapy license, long since revoked after allegations of abusive methods. She had never faced legal consequences. She had merely moved states and waited for the scandal to die down. Authorities descended upon the Weller residence like a swarm of hornets, collecting every scrap of evidence. Hidden videotapes, documents with falsified signatures, discrepancies in foster placement records. By then, the press was already sniffing around, capturing footage of the large suburban home cordoned off by police tape, bright lights flashing in the early evening gloom. Neighbors peered out, horrified, unable to reconcile the image of the perfect Weller couple with the monstrous reality that lurked within their garage. For Brandon, all that chaos whirled around him while he was moved to a temporary safe facility. His caseworker, Sharon, tried to coax out details of his experiences, but the boy struggled to speak of them. He had spent 3 nights in that hidden basement room, and those nights had seemed endless. Yet something had driven him to pass that note to the judge, a spark of defiance, or perhaps a realization that if he didn't speak up then he never would. Whatever the impetus, his quiet bravery unleashed a reckoning far bigger than anyone expected. Judge Miller found himself at the center of the storm, feeling more protective of this child than he typically allowed himself. He insisted on seeing Brandon's file in full, pushing social services for transparency, challenging colleagues about how such a placement had been allowed. The further he dug, the more sickened he became. But for Brandon, the question was simpler: where would he go now? The night after the raid on the Weller home, Brandon stayed in a small, cramped room at a youth assessment center. It wasn't fancy, but it was safe. Curled up on a thin mattress, he stared at the chipped paint on the cinder block walls. A single lamp cast a weak yellow light over a small desk. He'd been there before. This center was one of the first stops for kids who needed emergency placement. Brandon had encountered it more times than he cared to remember. Sleep was elusive. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the dusty steps leading to that cold basement. He remembered the silence down there, broken only by his own heartbeat. He recalled the camera in the corner, always recording, the dull red light blinking ominously in the darkness. Worst of all, he remembered how Michael and Dana had insisted he was just being disciplined for behavioral issues. They had a way of twisting everything, making him question his own grasp of reality. Maybe that was the scariest part, the way they had turned discipline into a slow erosion of his sense of self. He took a breath and tried to hold onto the memory of Judge Miller's face when he'd read the note. That instant of stunned realization, followed by the protectiveness that had made the judge call a recess on the spot. In that moment, Brandon felt as if the adult world had finally seen him, had finally noticed he was in peril. He needed that feeling now because the rest of his life seemed to have been swallowed by shadows. Still awake hours later, he shifted on the narrow bed, haunted by half-formed nightmares. He wondered if the other children, Marcus, Talia, Kevin, had left behind any clues. He wondered if the authorities would find them. He wondered if, in the face of the Wellers' cunning, justice would actually prevail. The next day, in a drab conference room at the youth center, Sharon sat across from Brandon. She was about 35, with short, practical hair and a warm but firm approach. She had worked in child welfare for over a decade, and the shock of the Weller case still coursed through her. She spread out some forms on the table, a notepad at the ready, and tried not to let her own anger show. "Brandon," she said softly, her voice carrying a gentleness that only came from hours spent trying to connect with traumatized children. "Can we talk about what happened?" Brandon nodded slightly. He kept his gaze on the floor. His shoulders hunched as though expecting a reprimand. "You're not in trouble," she continued. "Nobody is mad at you, okay? You did the right thing. I just want to make sure you're all right, and to see if there's anything you can tell me that might help." He swallowed and lifted his eyes to hers. For a moment, he struggled, and Sharon waited patiently. In her line of work, patience was everything. Finally, he whispered, "Are Michael and Dana in jail?" "They're both in custody," she answered carefully. "They'll be going through the courts now. I don't think they'll be getting out anytime soon." Brandon released a shaky breath. Part relief, part lingering fear. They had threatened him so often, told him that he would never be believed. And yet here he was, and they were the ones behind bars. Still, he couldn't completely trust it was over. "Do you want to share anything about what they did?" Sharon asked gently, pen poised over her pad. "I know it's hard, but the police need details." He looked away, a flush creeping up his cheeks. They made me sit in the room downstairs. They said it was for therapy, sometimes for hours. Dana would do these experiments. She'd have me read from notebooks or stand in one spot. If I moved, she wrote it down like I was failing a test. His voice trembled and cracked. She said if I told anyone, I'd end up in a place worse than that. Sharon swallowed. The calm neutrality in her face trembled for a second. She jotted down the notes. "That's terrible, Brandon. I'm so sorry you had to live with that. I promise we'll make sure nobody else gets hurt by them." He shifted uncomfortably, mindful of how often he'd heard empty promises. "There were others. I heard them talking about kids who were there before me. I don't know where they went. They said those kids got better and left, but they said weird things like how they tested them too. I don't know what happened to them." Sharon nodded, expression grim. "They have evidence that there were children before you. The police are following up on that." Brandon closed his eyes, the memory of that cold basement creeping back. "I wrote their names on the wall. Marcus, Talia, Kevin. I saw them in the notebooks. I never met them. But I felt like, if somebody found it, they'd keep looking." Sharon paused, shaken by the quiet bravery of this boy. "Brandon, you did more than most grown-ups would have done in your situation," she said softly. "Because of you, the police know where to look. We'll try to find them." He opened his eyes and met her gaze with a measured quiet. Then, unexpectedly, tears began to well. Sharon reached out, hesitated, then gently placed her hand over Brandon's. It felt awkward but necessary. He didn't pull away. In that moment, the boy realized there were people who believed him, who wanted to help him. For all he had been through, he clung to that fragile lifeline. Meanwhile, Judge Simon Miller found himself leaning over his office desk, flipping through the newly acquired case files on Michael and Dana Weller. He had seldom felt such a personal investment in a foster case before. He usually kept a stoic distance. An emotional wall was essential to survive the bureaucratic onslaught in the child welfare system. But this boy, Brandon, had gotten under his skin. The cryptic note, the hush of the courtroom, and the horrifying discovery in the Wellers' garage had jolted something in him. He couldn't look away. He studied the time-stamped documents the investigating team had forwarded, noting how official forms had been altered, how each child had apparently left the Wellers' care with an airtight paper trail that led nowhere. Judge Miller sniffed in disgust. It was not just abuse. It was a well-oiled machine of deception. How had this gone unnoticed for so long? He found a record for a child named Marcus Givens. The file said Marcus had been successfully reunited with paternal relatives. But the contact info listed was for an address that didn't exist. The phone number connected to a vacant lot. Another child, Talia Moore, apparently had been transferred to a therapeutic home in a neighboring county, but that county's social services had no record of her. Kevin Hernandez had a similarly fictional story. All told, it looked like at least 6 or 7 children had vanished from the Weller home, replaced with stacks of false documentation. Judge Miller murmured under his breath, "Dear God." The audacity and scale of it was overwhelming. He wondered how many times he had personally signed off on placements or read the names of children, just like Brandon, who had come and gone without raising suspicion. The thought made him feel like a hollow drum. He closed the file, took off his reading glasses, and pressed the heels of his hands into his eyes. Though his job mandated neutrality, he couldn't help feeling personally betrayed by the entire system. He had spent years presiding over child welfare cases, believing that the system, while flawed, largely worked. Now, for the first time, he questioned everything. Outside in the broader community, the Weller scandal erupted like a bombshell. It started with a subdued local news report showing the police tape around their house, but it quickly gathered traction. Journalists camped on the manicured lawn, interviewing neighbors who looked bewildered and gave statements like, "They seemed like such a nice couple," or, "They were always friendly, always volunteering." A hush fell over the neighborhood as everyone tried to reconcile the friendliest couple on the block with the monstrous allegations swirling around them. Soon, the media discovered the basement. The news vans multiplied, cameras capturing images of investigators removing evidence and placing it into unmarked vans. Word of the bizarre secret room and the missing children spread to national news. People across the country found themselves glued to their screens, riveted and horrified at the emerging details. Talk shows speculated about the psychological background of the Wellers, about whether there was a larger ring involved, about the failings of the foster system. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, the real work of building a case fell to the detectives and attorneys assigned to prosecute Michael and Dana. The Wellers themselves were in county detention, each in solitary confinement as a safety precaution. Both had lawyers who wasted no time attempting damage control, claiming innocence, blaming media sensationalism, and proposing some bizarre narrative about how the hidden room was part of an experimental therapy facility. None of it convinced the investigators. The more they dug, the more evidence they found. Footage of children in that bleak room, the notebooks meticulously documenting each child's reaction to isolation, and the false documents that Michael had used to hide the children's disappearances. The swirl of accusations, evidence, and public outrage formed a perfect storm. After so many years of apparently impeccable reputations, the Wellers were about to face the full wrath of a community betrayed, and a judicial system desperate to rectify its own oversight. But while the media dissected the Wellers' motives, Brandon was the one who lived with the aftermath. His nights were restless, and each day brought more questioning from police, social workers, and psychologists. It was like they were piecing together a giant puzzle that involved not just Brandon's experiences, but all the children who had come before him. At first, he found it overwhelming. He was used to trying to please adults, to keep his head down and avoid conflict. Now everyone wanted details. Did they use threats? Did they inflict physical harm? Did he ever see other children in the basement? How did they respond when he cried or begged to leave? Each question felt like a fresh bruise on his mind. But he forced himself to answer because he remembered the walls of that hidden room, the tally marks, and the empty eyes of the camera lens that recorded his every move. He had to keep going for the children who hadn't yet been found. Sometimes, in the nights, Brandon would think of the final day he spent with the Wellers. They had packed a bag for him, telling him that the adoption hearing was merely a formality. He remembered how tight Dana's smile had been, how she kept brushing his hair with meticulous care as if grooming him for a show. Michael had told him, "Today, you become part of this family forever. If you say anything that might confuse the judge, we'll know." The memory made Brandon's stomach churn. He realized that passing the note had been an act of rebellion that could have gone horribly wrong. But it hadn't. He was free now, even if that freedom was laced with confusion and fear. Several days later, in a fluorescent-lit hallway at the Youth Assessment Center, a detective named Russell Quinn approached Brandon for another interview. Detective Quinn was in his early 40s, with a trimmed beard and the kind of calm presence that put even frightened witnesses at ease. He found Brandon sitting in the lounge area, looking out the window at a small courtyard. Sharon, the caseworker, stood nearby. "Brandon," Detective Quinn said softly, "I'm sorry to bother you again, but we could really use your help." Brandon turned and offered a polite nod. He stood up, then followed Detective Quinn and Sharon to a smaller interview room. The detective produced a stack of photographs. They were various shots of the basement, grim angles capturing the stained mattress, the camera in the corner, the scrawled names, the shelves that contained notebooks. Brandon's face went pale just seeing them. His hand trembled a little, but he stayed quiet. "Could you tell me if you recognize anything in these photos?" Detective Quinn asked, spreading them out carefully. "Anything that might help us find the children who were here before?" Brandon leaned forward, scanning the images. He recognized the notebooks in one shot, the same ones Dana used to record everything. One black notebook in particular had been used for him. He remembered seeing other ones on the shelf, each labeled with codes or initials. There was a battered red spiral notebook that seemed older than the rest. He pointed to it in the photograph. "Dana said that was from a long time ago. I think she wrote stuff about kids who used to be here before me." His voice was barely above a whisper. "She'd talk about them sometimes. She said they failed therapy. That's why she needed new subjects." He swallowed hard, remembering the fear that welled in him whenever Dana called him a subject. Detective Quinn's jaw tightened. "We have that notebook in evidence now. It's filled with dates, codes, and references to punishments. Some of the references match missing children's names." He paused, clearly controlling his anger. "Did she ever mention what happened to them after they supposedly left?" Brandon shook his head. "She said they were transferred. Or they graduated. But I knew she was lying. When the kids were gone, I just never saw them again. And Michael never talked about them. It was like they just disappeared." Quinn exchanged a grim look with Sharon. "That lines up with what we've discovered," he said. "We think Michael forged documents for at least 6 kids. Possibly more. We're trying to track them all down, but it's been tough." Brandon nodded, staring down at the photos. He forced himself to look at each angle of that horrible room. The scratched cement floor, the tally marks that must have belonged to Marcus or Talia or Kevin. Had they tried to keep track of days, or was it something else? He tapped a part of the photo that showed a set of tallies near the corner. "I did that," he whispered. "I was trying to keep track of how many hours I was down there. But I lost count." Detective Quinn carefully placed a hand over Brandon's forearm, a gesture of solidarity. "We'll do our best to help find all those who were taken there," he said. "Your bravery might make all the difference." Brandon said nothing, but in the silence that followed, he felt a tiny flicker of pride that he'd done something good, something that mattered. As days turned into weeks, the investigation swelled. Detectives discovered evidence that the Wellers had been carefully grooming children, selecting the ones least likely to be missed or the ones with limited extended family, forging relationships with social workers who were overworked or inexperienced. The case extended beyond just 2 twisted individuals, as it began to raise questions about the entire oversight system that had allowed them to keep fostering without suspicion. Judge Miller, in a highly unusual move for a judge, personally recommended a statewide audit of the foster care process. There was talk of legislative hearings, and an independent review board was assembled to investigate. News anchors kept repeating terms like systemic failure and tragic oversight. The Wellers had become a face for cruelty hidden in plain sight. Public rage mounted, with many demanding immediate justice for the missing children. Michael and Dana sat in custody, each claiming ignorance or scapegoating the other. Dana said that Michael had forced her into it, that she was just following his instructions. Michael insisted that Dana was the mastermind, that he merely handled the bureaucratic side and had no knowledge of any actual abuse. But the footage seized from the camera in the basement told a different story. It showed both of them giving directives, punishing children, collaborating in the twisted isolation tactics. Brandon, meanwhile, tried to return to some semblance of normalcy, but he found it difficult to let go of the constant vigilance that had defined his life with the Wellers. He rarely slept through the night, always expecting to be jolted awake by a cold hand on his shoulder. Even though everyone around him insisted he was safe, it was hard for him to believe. The question burned in his mind. If the Wellers were so trusted by the system, how could he trust anyone ever again? A month after the discovery of the hidden room, a hearing was held to determine formal charges against Michael and Dana. The courthouse buzzed with reporters and onlookers who had come to witness the downfall of the once celebrated foster couple. Brandon watched from a distance, Not directly in the courtroom this time, but in a separate waiting area. He was accompanied by Sharon, who tried to shield him from the media. He wore a hooded sweatshirt, the hood pulled up to hide his face as they walked through the throng of cameras. "There they are," a reporter shouted, the camera flash popping like miniature explosions. "Brandon, did the Wellers threaten you? Brandon, did you see other kids in that basement?" He froze, glaring at the floor. Sharon placed an arm around him protectively. "No comments," she said firmly, ushering him through the double doors into the safety of the hallway beyond. Once inside, the chaos subsided into the more regulated hush of legal proceedings. She guided him to a bench near the back. The courthouse was packed, so the two of them ended up sitting near a few curious spectators. Brandon could see the back of Michael's and Dana's heads in the front row, sitting at separate tables with their respective legal teams. He felt a shiver run down his spine. Even from this distance, even though they sat handcuffed, they still seemed to exert a chilling power. He tried to control his breathing as the judge read out the charges: child endangerment, abuse, kidnapping, falsification of records, and more. The list went on and on. Dana's attorney argued for bail, citing that she was not a flight risk, that she had strong community ties. But the prosecution pointed out the severity of the crimes, the potential for witness tampering, and the elaborate deception that had already been uncovered. Michael's attorney similarly argued for bail, but the judge denied both requests. Brandon exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. At least for now, they'd remain in jail. Through the entire proceeding, Michael kept glancing around with a mixture of defiance and desperation. He occasionally locked eyes with Brandon, who tried to shrink back behind Sharon. Dana, on the other hand, stared straight ahead, her face expressionless, her posture rigid. It was unnerving, as though she felt no remorse or fear. Brandon remembered that stare from the basement when she would watch him, scribbling notes in her black notebook about how long it would take before he followed her instructions without question. When the hearing concluded, the crowd funneled out, muttering among themselves. Sharon stayed seated with Brandon for a few extra moments, giving the Wellers time to be escorted away. Only when the coast was clear did she guide him toward a side exit, away from the cameras. The entire ordeal left him exhausted and trembling. He knew it was far from over. Over the following weeks, tensions heightened as new revelations emerged. Another foster child, now a teenager living on the streets, came forward, identifying herself as Talia, one of the children whose name was scratched into the basement wall. Talia had run away at 15, fleeing the Wellers' house in the middle of the night. She had never reported the abuse, convinced nobody would believe her. But when she saw the news coverage on a beat-up television in a shelter, she recognized her former tormentors and decided to speak out. Her testimony was damning. She recounted how the Wellers would rotate children in and out of the basement for misbehavior, how they used psychological manipulation to keep them obedient, how Dana had once locked her in for 2 days straight with only water and a bucket. Talia described how she had planned her escape for weeks, waiting for Michael to run errands and for Dana to be distracted. She slipped out a window and ran, never looking back. Now, she provided the police with a statement that corroborated many of Brandon's accounts and introduced fresh horrors that even he didn't know about. The more the authorities learned, the more the story sounded like something out of a nightmare. The cruelty was carefully concealed beneath layers of forged documents and respectable public personas. Each new testimony or piece of evidence stripped away another layer of deception. Brandon followed the news with a mixture of trepidation and relief. He felt vindicated that others were coming forward, that he wasn't alone. At the same time, each fresh account of cruelty triggered more nightmares. He had regular appointments with a therapist, a soft-spoken woman named Dr. Graham, who specialized in trauma. She guided him through drawing exercises, writing journals, and gentle conversation that helped him process what he had been through. Some days he felt too exhausted to speak. On better days, he managed to describe his fear, anger, and confusion in halting sentences. He sometimes wondered if Marcus and Kevin would also come forward. Had they run away like Talia? Or did something worse befall them? Late at night, he gripped the edges of his pillow, imagining them out there, watching the news, fearful or unable to speak. He hoped they were still alive, but no one had found them yet. Meanwhile, the public's outrage grew. Citizens demanded to know how Michael and Dana had been allowed to foster so many children with virtually no oversight. Political leaders rushed to deflect blame, claiming that the Wellers were master liars and that the system had been duped. But a sense of anger and betrayal flooded the community. Protesters gathered outside government buildings with signs reading, "Protect our children," and "End foster system corruption." Furious parents wrote letters to the editor of the local paper, condemning officials for letting a scandal of this magnitude slip by. A media spotlight shone directly on the local Department of Child Services. The director of the agency gave a strained press conference, offering condolences and explaining that staff shortages and bureaucratic blind spots had contributed to the oversight. None of it felt sufficient to the general public. People wanted accountability. They wanted to know how the Wellers could pass inspection after inspection when they had a torture chamber hidden behind a false wall. Inside the labyrinth of child welfare offices, morale plummeted. Social workers felt under siege. They were exhausted, carrying huge caseloads, often not having the time or resources to investigate every suspicion thoroughly. Some staff members worried they, too, might have placed a child with the Wellers at some point. Guilt and fear circulated through the hallways, along with frantic efforts to fix the system that had allowed Michael and Dana's deception to flourish. For Brandon's caseworker, Sharon, the entire fiasco felt personal. She had never personally assigned a child to the Wellers, but she knew co-workers who had. Everyone had believed the glowing references, the immaculate house, the seemingly genuine desire to help children. Now it haunted her to think of all the red flags they might have missed. She channeled that guilt into fierce devotion to Brandon's well-being. She accompanied him to every interview, shielded him from intrusive reporters, and checked on him constantly. She knew that while the public's focus might fade in time, Brandon would carry the scars forever. Months passed, and the case against the Wellers strengthened. Prosecutors prepared for a trial that promised to be sensational and emotionally harrowing. Multiple survivors agreed to testify. The police also found partial remains in a wooded area behind a property Michael owned upstate. Dental records identified them as Kevin, one of the children who had vanished from the Weller household. The news rocked Brandon when he heard it. He sat in stunned silence as Sharon gently explained what they had found. He cried for a boy he had never met, but whose name he had scrawled on that concrete wall in a desperate attempt to preserve his memory. The discovery fueled calls for the Wellers to face charges that could carry life sentences. Michael's attorney tried to cast doubt on the evidence, suggesting that the remains identification was inconclusive. But a more thorough forensic examination confirmed it was Kevin without question. A wave of horror swept the community once again, intensifying the demand for a swift and merciless resolution. Brandon wrestled with overwhelming guilt. He felt he should have done more, spoken sooner, or asked more questions while he was still with the Wellers. Rationally, he knew he couldn't have saved Kevin, but the weight of it still pressed on his heart. Dr. Graham spent many sessions helping him process the grief for someone he'd never known face to face. As the trial date approached, speculation about a plea deal surfaced. Some said Dana might turn on Michael and provide more information about the missing children in exchange for a reduced sentence. Others believed Michael would blame everything on Dana, claiming he was duped by her psychological manipulations. The reality was that, from the evidence, both seemed equally culpable. Disturbing videos showed them working in tandem, punishing children, forcing them into that secret room. The attorneys on each side braced for a lengthy, high-profile spectacle. By this point, Brandon was living in a new foster home. The couple, Adam and Teresa James, had no other children. They had a large backyard, a golden retriever named Molly, and an earnest, open demeanor. They were appalled by the Weller case, aware that it might be hard for Brandon to trust any adult again. They moved slowly with him, never raising their voices or pushing him to open up. A bed of sunflowers grew in their garden, Teresa's pride and joy. She invited Brandon to help water them or pick weeds, or just stand beside her in companionable silence. He was grateful for the gentleness, the space to just exist without fear. Still, nights remained difficult. He woke up with nightmares of being pulled back into that basement. Adam and Teresa would rush to his room, comforting him as best they could. In time, the nightmares receded. Each little act of kindness chipped away at the fortress of trauma he carried inside. Sharon visited often, to check how he was settling in and to update him on the ongoing investigation. He started middle school in their district, trying to catch up on classes he had missed. He was quiet and withdrawn at first, an easy target for teasing. But one or two classmates sensed his vulnerability and took him under their wing. A boy named Ethan invited him to play basketball after school, and a girl named Sarai showed him around the hallways, pointing out teachers and lockers so he wouldn't get lost. Small gestures like that reminded him there was good in the world. At last, the day of reckoning arrived. The Wellers trial began. The courthouse steps swarmed with reporters once again. Spectators lined the corridors, eager to claim a seat in what was already being dubbed the trial of the decade in that county. The prosecution's opening statements outlined the scope of the horror, detailing the hidden basement, the forged documents, and the emotional and physical torment inflicted on multiple children. The defense tried to depict Dana as mentally ill, claiming that Michael had capitalized on her condition for financial gain. Michael's defense tried to argue that he was simply a paperwork man, oblivious to the extreme abuse. The prosecution scoffed. There were videos of Michael in the basement, giving orders. Talia, now a young adult, took the stand first. She described her ordeal in chilling detail, recounting the hours spent locked in the dark, the humiliation, the systematic breaking of her spirit. Some spectators wept openly as she recounted the day she ran away. Dana stared at Talia without blinking. Michael looked down at the table. Other survivors who had come forward testified similarly, though many had different experiences based on how long they had stayed and the specific forms of punishment. Each story painted a mosaic of cruelty behind the Wellers' seemingly virtuous facade. Brandon, deemed a key witness, was scheduled to testify closer to the end of the trial, at the request of the prosecutors who wanted to end with a powerful statement from the child whose single note had toppled the entire operation. When Brandon's turn finally arrived, he stepped into the witness box wearing a crisp white shirt and khaki pants that Teresa had ironed for him. He tried to ignore the sea of faces behind him, focusing instead on the prosecutor, Ms. Langston, a tall woman with a commanding presence and kind eyes. She guided him through direct questions, ensuring his voice was steady but never pushing too hard. He described the day he was taken to the basement the first time, how Dana told him it was necessary therapy for his rebelliousness, how Michael set up the camera in the corner. Brandon spoke haltingly, describing the fear that kept him silent, the moments of humiliating compliance, the days he spent convinced no one would save him. He revealed how he mustered the courage to slip that note to Judge Miller, that single desperate act. Then came the cross-examination. Dana's lawyer tried to rattle him by asking pointed questions, trying to suggest that Brandon misinterpreted experimental therapy, or that he was exaggerating. Brandon felt his stomach churn as the attorney said phrases like disciplinary methods that might have been misunderstood. He answered each question quietly, letting Ms. Langston object when the defense strayed too far or harassed him. At one point, the defense attorney asked, "Do you have any proof that you weren't just sent to a timeout room? Children's imaginations can run wild." Brandon looked down, gathering his courage. He remembered Dr. Graham's advice, "Speak your truth, clearly and calmly." "There was a camera," he said softly, "and notebooks. The police found them. And there's a lock on the outside. If it was just a timeout, why would it need a lock?" The defense attorney grimaced, not having a good answer. Ms. Langston finished by letting Brandon confirm the role Michael played, verifying that he had personally locked the basement door. Then, with the judge's permission, Brandon was excused. He stepped off the stand, feeling as though a weight had lifted from him, but also trembling, like he had just run a marathon. Outside the courtroom, Sharon and Teresa were waiting. Teresa quickly enveloped him in a hug that smelled of fresh peppermint gum and lilac perfume. Sharon stroked his hair. "You did great," she told him, her voice thick with emotion. "You were so brave." Brandon simply leaned into them both, tears sliding down his face. He hadn't realized how much he needed that moment of comfort, that feeling that he wasn't alone anymore. The trial marched on for weeks, a litany of horrors laid out for the jury. The defense tried every maneuver they could, discrediting witnesses, claiming tainted evidence, painting Dana as a victim of manipulative mental illness and Michael as a naive partner. But the sheer volume of proof was overwhelming: videotapes of children sobbing in the basement, the notebooks with Dana's handwriting detailing her behavior modification techniques, the forged documentation that Michael had created. Near the trial's end, a forensic document expert testified, showing exactly how Michael had used official forms to create false narratives about each child's departure. The prosecutor hammered home the point that both Michael and Dana had to be in sync for such a large-scale deception to go undetected for so long. Eventually, closing arguments were made. The prosecution spoke passionately about the moral and legal responsibility the Wellers had violated, citing the victims' testimonies and physical evidence. The defense was forced to rely on last-ditch attempts at emotional appeal and insinuations of mental incompetence, none of which seemed to resonate with the jury. When the jury was sequestered to deliberate, a hushed tension settled over the courthouse. Brandon stayed home that day, too anxious to wait among the swirl of media. He sat on the living room couch at the Jameses' house, the news on low volume in the background. Adam and Teresa hovered around him, offering him cookies, a board game, anything to keep his mind off the verdict. After hours of stifling anticipation, a news alert announced that the jury had reached a decision. They gathered around the TV, Brandon perched on the edge of the couch. The anchor reported that the Wellers were found guilty on multiple counts: child endangerment, aggravated false imprisonment, fraud, and even a homicide charge for Kevin's death. Sentencing would come later, but the news was triumphant in tone. Brandon felt a tidal wave of relief flood him, followed by an unexpected surge of sadness for all the children who hadn't made it out in time. Adam squeezed his shoulder. "It's over, buddy," he said. "They're not going to hurt you or anyone else again." Brandon nodded, tears burning at the corners of his eyes. "I hope they find all the others," he whispered. Teresa gently rubbed his back. "They'll keep looking," she promised. "Thanks to you, they know where to look." In the weeks that followed, the public reveled in the Wellers' downfall. The sentencing hearing was a formality. The judge imposed heavy prison terms for both Michael and Dana, decades behind bars, with no chance of parole. When confronted by the media, Michael tried to deliver a tearful apology, claiming he'd been deceived by his wife's twisted methods, but no one believed him. Dana maintained a hollow stare, never acknowledging her role. Even in the face of overwhelming evidence, she denied everything, insisting that the system had misunderstood her therapy work. Neither defendant garnered sympathy from the public. A wave of policy reforms swept the foster care system. The fiasco spurred thorough internal investigations with new protocols, surprise home checks, and improved training for social workers. The entire state wrestled with the realization that the unimaginable had happened under its watch. Though bureaucratic changes don't happen overnight, the Weller case had lit a fire that demanded accountability and a more vigilant approach. Brandon, freed from the swirl of cameras and courtrooms, turned his focus to living day by day with the Jameses. They didn't push him to talk about the trial or about the Wellers. Instead, they nurtured him in small, meaningful ways. Teresa taught him to cook simple meals. Adam taught him how to fix a bike chain. They gave him chores that included feeding Molly, their golden retriever, and weeding the garden. Normal tasks that grounded him, that reminded him life could be peaceful and kind. He still had therapy sessions with Dr. Graham, who encouraged him to keep drawing and writing. Over time, the nightmares diminished. He made a few close friends at school. Ethan and Sarai remained constants, introducing him to school clubs and inviting him to their after-school hangouts. He found himself laughing at Ethan's jokes, discussing music with Sarai, and slowly letting the dark memories recede into the background of his life. On the last day of the school year, Sharon stopped by the James house to drop off some documents. She handed Brandon a small frame. Inside was the scrap of paper he had shown Judge Miller. "Look behind garage." It had been preserved, the writing faded but still legible. Alongside it was a tiny corner of the crude map he had drawn. She smiled softly. "Judge Miller sent this for you," she said. "He thought you might want to keep it, or at least have something to remember how brave you were. Brandon held it in his hands, speechless. Memories flooded back, his heart pounding in that silent courtroom, summoning the courage to reveal the note. He felt a shiver, but it was different now. That note no longer held just fear, it also held the relief of a life saved. Carefully, he placed it on a small shelf in his new room, next to a few school trophies and photos with Adam and Teresa. Later that evening, while watering the sunflowers with Teresa, he looked over at her. "Do you think they'll ever find Talia's family?" he asked. He knew Talia had said she had no one, but there was always a chance. Teresa's eyes saddened. "I don't know," she admitted. "Sometimes families drift apart, or they can't be found. But I know Talia is getting help, just like you did." He nodded, turning off the hose. Water droplets sparkled on the flower petals. "I hope she finds peace." "I think she will," Teresa said gently. "She's strong like you." He set the hose aside, gazing at the bright yellow heads of the sunflowers that seemed to crane toward the sky. "I still feel bad," he murmured. "Not everyone made it out okay." Teresa placed a hand on his shoulder. "You did everything you could. Because of you, Talia's safe, and other kids will never have to go through what you did." He swallowed hard and nodded. The wind rustled through the garden, carrying with it the scent of earth and fresh possibilities. That summer, Brandon spent many afternoons riding his bike around the neighborhood. Sometimes Ethan joined him, the two weaving lazily down streets and exploring the local park. On his own, Brandon found a favorite spot near a pond where ducks congregated. He'd stop and just watch them, soothed by the gentle quacking and the glistening water. The terror of the Weller basement felt a lifetime away, though it never fully vanished. Sometimes a chill still crept over him, especially when he heard a door slam unexpectedly. But each day, the fear loosened its grip, replaced by new memories of normal childhood adventures. Adam taught him how to fish at a nearby lake. On those calm mornings, they'd wake before dawn, pack a thermos of hot chocolate, and head to the shore. Sitting there with a fishing rod in hand, Brandon found a kind of serenity he'd never known. The rising sun reflected off the water, painting the sky with orange and pink. The gentle lapping of waves against the shore lulled him into relaxation. He hardly cared if they caught anything. He just cherished the peace. Occasionally, he'd see a news headline mentioning the Weller trial's aftermath, new discovered evidence, or a mention of how the case led to the passing of a law requiring stricter oversight of foster homes. Each time, he felt a complicated mix of pride and sorrow. Pride that his single note had toppled a terrible scheme, sorrow that it had ever existed in the first place. By the time the new school year rolled around, Brandon was more settled than he ever remembered being. He wasn't officially adopted by Adam and Teresa yet, but they were exploring the idea. The conversation around it was gentle, never rushed. He had heard so many promises of permanency before that he feared jinxing it by hoping too hard. Yet day by day, the bond between them felt more like a family. One chilly autumn evening, they were sitting around the dining table, finishing dinner. Teresa cleared plates while Adam sipped coffee. Brandon lingered, fiddling with his fork. Finally, Adam spoke. "You've been with us for a while now," he said. "We've learned a lot about you, and you've learned about us. We want you to know that we love having you here. We'd love to make this arrangement permanent if you'd like that." Brandon froze, his eyes flicking from Adam to Teresa, who had set down the dishes and now stood by his side. "Really?" he managed. His heart thundered, excitement mingling with residual fear. Teresa's face lit up. "Really? But only if you feel comfortable. We never want you to feel pressured." Brandon swallowed. He remembered the Wellers telling him something similar, only to reveal their true motives later. But he reminded himself that Adam and Teresa had never forced him into anything. They had never locked doors, never raised a hand or voice to him. They had shown him kindness, respect, and patience. Finally, he nodded, tears prickling his eyes. "Yeah, I want that," he whispered. Teresa's eyes filled with tears, and she hugged him, her warmth seeping into him like a balm. Adam rested a hand on his shoulder, beaming. For a moment, Brandon felt something he could only describe as genuine belonging. It felt foreign and wonderful all at once. They spent the next few minutes discussing what the formal adoption process would entail: more paperwork, a few court visits, an official hearing. Sharon would be there to support them. Brandon felt anxious at the thought of returning to a courthouse, but Adam reassured him that it would be different this time, a celebration of a new family, not a den of horrors. Brandon believed him. While the adoption progressed, Judge Miller's words lingered in Brandon's memory. He recalled how the judge had thanked him after reading the note, simple words that carried enormous weight. As the date for his adoption hearing drew near, Brandon wondered if Judge Miller might preside over it. He found the idea oddly comforting, as though everything had come full circle. On a crisp morning in early December, Brandon found himself back in a courthouse, but not the same imposing one where the Weller trial had happened. This smaller family court building felt less intimidating. The halls were painted in warm colors, and the staff greeted him with reassuring smiles. Adam and Teresa walked beside him, while Sharon carried a small stack of files. To his surprise and relief, the judge handling the adoption was indeed Judge Miller. When Brandon entered the courtroom, he recognized the same kindly but serious face. Judge Miller gave him a small smile. "Welcome, Brandon," he said, scanning the documents. "I see we meet again under far better circumstances." Brandon nodded, heart pounding but not in the frightened way it once had. He stood between Adam and Teresa, whose hands he clutched. The hearing was quick, a formality, really, since everything had been arranged in advance. But to Brandon, it felt monumental. Judge Miller asked if he consented to this adoption. Brandon said yes in a clear, unwavering voice. Then, with a few strokes of a pen, it became official. Adam and Teresa James were now legally his parents. There was no applause in the courtroom. It wasn't the style of the place, but the emotion in the air was palpable. Judge Miller leaned forward and said, "Brandon, you've shown remarkable courage. I'm thrilled to finalize an adoption that grants you the family you deserve." Tears spilled down Brandon's cheeks. He looked at Adam and Teresa, who looked equally emotional. Sharon beamed, discreetly dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. Judge Miller softly added, "I hope your future is filled with peace and happiness, son." After the hearing, they gathered in the hallway, hugging and taking photos with a phone. Sharon insisted on a few pictures for the official record, saying that this moment deserved to be remembered. Brandon, normally camera-shy, relented with a shy grin. He felt lighter, as though a huge stone had been lifted from his life. The darkness of the Wellers' basement wasn't gone from his mind, but now it coexisted with hope, love, and a promise of safety. He realized that while one chapter of his life had been filled with pain, a new one was beginning, a chapter he could fill with better memories. A few weeks later, as the holiday season approached, Brandon started to notice small changes in his mindset. He no longer jumped at every sudden noise. He laughed more readily at Ethan's jokes. He found joy in decorating the Christmas tree with Teresa, carefully hanging shiny ornaments while cheerful music played in the background. Adam teased him about how precise he was with the placement, and Brandon teased him back. It felt like a home, not just a house. One afternoon, the doorbell rang, and Brandon opened it to find a delivery person with a certified envelope. Inside was a handwritten note from Judge Miller, along with an official copy of Brandon's final adoption decree. The note read, "Brandon, I hope this finds you well. I wanted you to have this official copy as a keepsake, though I know your parents already have one. Consider it a reminder of your courage and the new life you've built. Best wishes, Judge Simon Miller." Brandon held the decree carefully, marveling at how a single piece of paper could represent something so huge. He brought it to Adam and Teresa, who both smiled widely and said they'd frame it if Brandon wanted. He nodded. Something about seeing it displayed might help him fully believe in his new reality. He was no longer a ward of the state or a child drifting through the system. He was part of a family that chose him, and that he, in turn, had chosen. That night, he reflected on the quiet bedroom that was now his own. No hidden locks, no camera in the corner, no forced isolation. Just the faint hum of the heater and the soft glow of a nightlight shaped like a small moon. He drifted to sleep thinking of Kevin, Marcus, Talia, and all the other names that had been scrawled on that basement wall. He silently promised them that he would never forget. Their stories had shaped his own. He wished them peace, wherever they were, hoping more survivors might step forward and find their own moments of justice. Time flowed on. Seasons changed. Brandon grew comfortable with the rhythms of his new life: daily chores, homework, bike rides with friends, weekend fishing trips with Adam. He discovered he had an interest in art, enjoying how he could sketch out the tangled emotions in his mind and turn them into something visual. Teresa hung some of his drawings on the fridge, simple pencil sketches at first, then more detailed work as he gained confidence. When a teacher at school noticed his talent, she encouraged him to join the art club. He did, reluctantly at first, but soon found it was a safe space to explore his creativity. He made new friends who shared his interest in painting and sculpture. He still attended therapy sessions with Dr. Graham, though less frequently now. Once a week became once every 2 weeks, then once a month. Each session felt more like a friendly check-in than a deep excavation of trauma. She would ask how he was doing, and he would talk about normal kid things: projects at school, a new arcade in town, or a girl in his class who had caught his eye. The Wellers' basement rarely came up anymore, unless Dr. Graham gently asked about his memories. Even then, it felt more like he was recalling a distant nightmare than living inside it. Nevertheless, certain triggers remained. If he heard someone mention foster home, he felt a slight pang of anxiety. The sound of keys jangling in a lock sometimes jolted him, stirring a surge of unease. But these reactions lessened with time. Adam and Teresa never tried to rush him into forgetting. They just reassured him that healing could take as long as he needed. The media frenzy died down. Occasionally, an anniversary article or a news segment revisited the Weller case, highlighting how it led to improvements in foster care oversight. Michael and Dana rarely made headlines anymore. They sat in their cells, their appeals failing one by one. The system that had once been so easy for them to manipulate was now significantly less forgiving. The intangible, monstrous hold they had once had over Brandon no longer felt real. A year after the final trial, Brandon found himself invited to a small ceremony at the state capitol. A group of foster youth advocates wanted to recognize him, along with Talia and a few others, for their courage in exposing the Wellers' crimes. Brandon didn't like public speaking, but he understood how important it was to show that survivors could stand tall. Talia was there, older and more confident than the last time he had seen her in court. She gave him a hug, thanking him for coming forward. He thanked her for testifying, for not running forever. During the ceremony, several officials delivered speeches about the new legislation and reforms. Brandon and Talia received small plaques recognizing their contribution to bringing truth to light. Cameras flashed, local politicians posed with them, and applause erupted. Brandon felt his cheeks burn with a mixture of pride and embarrassment. He glanced over at Adam and Teresa, who were wiping their eyes discreetly. For all the superficial pomp of the event, Brandon felt a real sense of accomplishment. He hoped that these reforms would stop other children from falling into the clutches of people like the Wellers. Afterward, Talia asked him if he wanted to join her and some other advocates at a nearby coffee shop. Brandon looked back at Adam and Teresa, who nodded their permission. The small group ended up around a table, sipping hot chocolate and sharing experiences. Talia described the transitional housing program she'd entered after the trial. She was working on finishing her GED and had hopes of becoming a social worker someday. Another advocate spoke of her own story in the system, how she narrowly escaped an abusive foster home. It was a sobering conversation, but also strangely uplifting. They had survived, and they were determined to reshape the system that had failed them. As Brandon walked out of the shop later that evening, the autumn air crisp against his cheeks, he felt an odd connection to these people. They were like a second family, a family of survivors who understood him in a way few could. He realized that the horrifying chapter with the Wellers had led him to these connections, to a deeper empathy for others who had walked a similarly treacherous path. When Brandon turned 15, he applied for a part-time summer internship at a local animal shelter. He had always liked animals, and the folks at the shelter were glad for the extra help. He cleaned cages, fed kittens, and walked dogs. The routine soothed him, and the gratitude of the animals reminded him of the healing power of kindness. Sometimes, he thought of how terrified he had been in that locked basement, and how just a single note had changed everything. It was almost surreal to think about now, while kneeling in the bright sunshine outside the shelter, playing with an excited puppy. Adam and Teresa found it incredible how far he'd come. He still had moments of caution, times when he closed himself off emotionally. But they had grown to understand his silent spells, and they knew the best way to help was by offering him consistent love, patience, and gentle humor. They never pried too much or tried to force him to talk about the darkest parts of his past. They trusted him to come to them if he needed to. And sometimes, on nights when insomnia struck, he would tiptoe into their living room just to sit quietly in their presence, comforted by the soft glow of a lamp and the knowledge that he was no longer alone. By the time he neared his 16th birthday, Brandon felt a subtle shift in how he viewed the past. It no longer defined him. It had shaped him, yes, but it was not the entirety of who he was. He had a future, goals, dreams. He considered a career in counseling or social work, much like Talia, wanting to help others who might be trapped in harmful situations. Or maybe art school. For the first time in his life, the possibilities felt endless. One late afternoon, while drawing in his room, he heard a faint knock. Adam poked his head in, a cautious smile on his face. "Hey, bud," he said. "Remember how you wanted to update your room? We found a neat bed frame online we can afford. Want to check it out?" Brandon grinned. "Sure," he replied. "I was just sketching. Come see." Adam stepped in and glanced at the sketchbook. Brandon had drawn an older boy kneeling in front of a locked door, a faint light shining from beneath it. But behind the boy stood a grown figure with a key, guiding him away from that door. Adam recognized the imagery, feeling a pang in his chest. "It's really good," he said softly. "Poignant." Brandon closed the sketchbook, feeling a flush warm his face. He shrugged. "It's just something I was thinking about." Adam gently placed a hand on Brandon's shoulder. "Son, I'm proud of you. I know it hasn't been easy, but seeing you grow into this talented, compassionate young man, it's the greatest honor of my life." Brandon's throat tightened. He tried to form words but found himself unable, so he just nodded. Adam gave him a small smile, then handed him the tablet to look at the bed frame. They discussed color choices, something ordinary and sweet, a stark contrast to all the darkness that once consumed them. Later that evening, Brandon stared at the small framed note on his shelf. "Look behind garage." The edges were frayed, the ink slightly faded. He thought about how those 3 words had set everything into motion, how sometimes the smallest action could have the most enormous consequences. He felt a lump in his throat, a burst of gratitude for the moment when he handed that note to Judge Miller. Without it, he might still be trapped or worse. Yet the world kept spinning. People found reasons to hope, to heal, to move forward. Brandon laid on his bed and scrolled through a text from Talia, who had passed her GD test. He typed back a congratulations, a grin spreading across his face. In the living room, Teresa laughed at some comedic video, and Adam's voice joined hers. Down the hallway, Molly scratched at her dog Bowl, impatient for dinner. Life was sweetly, beautifully normal, a normal that Brandon had never believed could exist for him. As he looked back on it all, Brandon recognized that the fight for justice had been relentless and painful, stretching over many months. But in the end, the Weller facade had collapsed. The judge's gavel and the weight of public outrage had done their part. And for those who had emerged from the Wellers' clutches, it was not just a moment of liberation, it was a gateway to rebuilding their lives. Betrayal had turned into resilience. Pain had turned into determination. And Brandon? He was living proof that even the quietest voice could topple a seemingly untouchable evil. He understood now that truth, once uncovered, casts a light so bright it can never be fully extinguished. Even if it had started with a single folded note, that truth had traveled far, saving not only his life, but opening the door to hope for others. And if you believe the truth should always come to light, be sure to like and subscribe for more. Thanks for watching.